In a sun-scorched desert town where justice had become nothing more than a mirage, a group of ruthless thugs thought they'd found their perfect target, a quiet 65-year-old widow running a remote survival supply store. They didn't know they were about to cross paths with the legendary Desert Shadow, a vigilante commander whose network of former special operators had been silently protecting travelers and towns across 3 states. This is the story of how Natasa Blackwood's decades of secret operations were finally revealed, transforming not just a band of criminals, but an entire chain of communities across the southwestern frontier. Hey there, before we begin, share where you're watching from down below, and if this story of justice and redemption resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we've got something even more thrilling lined up for you. The merciless desert sun beat down on Crossroads Trading Post as Natasa Blackwood arranged the survival gear displays with practiced precision. Her weathered hands moved with deliberate efficiency, each item placed exactly where a traveler in distress might need to find it quickly. The morning ritual was interrupted only by the soft chime of wind bells she'd hung 15 years ago, their gentle song a stark contrast to the harsh landscape surrounding her outpost. To the casual observer, Natasa was just another desert dweller, one of the hardy souls who'd chosen to make their home in this unforgiving corner of the Southwest. Her silver hair was always neatly braided, her clothes practical but well-maintained, her smile warm but reserved. The locals knew her as the widow who'd taken over her husband's trading post after his passing, turning it into an essential stopover for anyone traversing the vast desert expanses. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," called out Miguel, a young border patrol agent, as he pulled up in his dusty SUV. "Got any of those electrolyte packets left? Thompson's team is heading out for a 3-day patrol." "Just restocked yesterday," Natasa replied, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades anticipating others' needs. "Come on in, I'll throw in some of those new solar-powered emergency beacons too. Been too many stranded travelers lately." The regulars knew her store was more than just a business. It was a lifeline in a landscape that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Mrs. Henderson's ancient pickup truck rattled into view right on schedule, kicking up clouds of red dust as it approached. The retired nurse had been Natasa's first customer when she'd rebuilt the trading post, and she hadn't missed a weekly supply run in 15 years. "The usual, Natasa?" Helen Henderson called out, climbing down from her truck with a canvas bag of fresh vegetables from her greenhouse. "And maybe some of those new water filters you mentioned." "Coming right up, Helen. How's the clinic doing?" Natasa asked, already gathering Mrs. Henderson's standard order with efficient movements that belied her age. "Oh, you know how it is out here. Never enough supplies, but we manage." Helen's voice dropped slightly. "Speaking of managing, did you hear about those thugs causing trouble down in Snake Valley? They've been targeting isolated businesses, demanding protection money. Poor old Joe had to abandon his gas station after they vandalized it. Sheriffs spread too thin to do much about it." Natasa's hands paused briefly as she wrapped Mrs. Henderson's supplies in brown paper. "Can't say that I have," she said quietly, but something in her tone made Mrs. Henderson look up sharply. "What kind of trouble exactly?" "Bad kind," Helen continued, leaning closer. "They call themselves the Scorpion Syndicate. Real piece of work. Ex-cons and desert rats who've banded together. They're moving their way up the highway, getting bolder with each success. Law enforcement's got their hands full with the drug runners. These folks are falling through the cracks." Natasa nodded, her mind already calculating distances, timelines, vulnerabilities. "World's full of predators, Helen. But out here in the desert, even the smallest scorpion needs to watch out for the hawk." As Mrs. Henderson drove away, Natasa reached beneath her counter, past the logbook filled with detailed notes about travelers in distress, and touched a satellite phone hidden in a secret compartment. It connected her to a network that most people thought was just another desert legend. A group of former special operators, intelligence agents, and law enforcement who'd chosen to continue their mission far from official oversight. The morning continued peacefully. Truckers stopped for water and emergency supplies. Tourists asked for guidance about safe routes, and locals shared news and warnings about desert conditions. Natasa's trading post, strategically positioned at the intersection of two lonely highways, had become a beacon of hope for anyone braving these treacherous lands. Around mid-morning, the peaceful routine shattered like a mirage in the desert heat. The rumble started as a distant thunder, growing louder until it drowned out even the persistent wind. 3 modified muscle cars roared into view, their matte black paint jobs absorbing the sunlight like demons risen from the desert floor. Natasa watched as her current customers, a family of tourists and an old prospector, quickly finished their business and left, avoiding eye contact with the newcomers. The vehicles pulled into the gravel parking area, their formation practiced, but sloppy to Natasa's trained eye. Their leader, a tall man with a scorpion tattoo crawling up his neck, emerged from the first car, his boots crunching on the sun-baked gravel as he approached the store. A predatory smile played across his face, unaware that he was walking into the den of a far more dangerous hunter. The desert winds whispered through the wind chimes, their melody now seeming more like a warning than a welcome. Natasa Blackwood stood behind her counter, watching, waiting, her decades of experience telling her that the true storm was just beginning to gather on the horizon. "Nice setup you got here, Grandma," the tattooed man said, his voice carrying the artificial sweetness of a rattlesnake's warning. His eyes scanned the shelves of survival gear, water supplies, and emergency equipment, mentally calculating their worth. "Water's $5 a gallon," Natasa responded calmly, continuing to organize a display of solar-powered lanterns. "Veterans and law enforcement get a 20% discount." Her movements remained deliberate, each motion refined by years of training that her unwanted visitors couldn't begin to suspect. The man laughed, the sound echoing off the tin roof like scattered gravel. "Name's Venom, and we're not here for water, sweetheart. We're here to discuss your new security arrangement. See, these highways can be dangerous for a lonely widow." Natasa studied him carefully, noting how the other 4 men spread out through her store in an amateur attempt at tactical positioning. One lingered near the communication equipment, another by the water supplies, while 2 more blocked the entrance. She'd seen better formations in basic training. The trading post's interior remained cool despite the desert heat, thanks to the clever design Natasa had implemented during renovation. Multiple exits, reinforced walls, and strategic sightlines. Features that appeared decorative to the casual observer, but served much more practical purposes. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors that had supported countless travelers seeking refuge from the harsh landscape. "The only security this post needs," Natasa replied, setting down a lantern with practiced precision, "is already provided by the good folks in uniform who patrol these roads. Been that way for 15 years. Venom's face darkened. One of his men knocked over a display of emergency flares, while another ran his fingers along a shelf of preserved foods, deliberately pushing cans onto the floor. The metallic clatter punctuated the tense atmosphere. "Let me be clear, old lady," Venom growled, leaning over the counter. The scorpion on his neck seemed to writhe with his movement. $2,000 a week, or accidents start happening. Lots of ways for a place to burn in this heat. Lots of ways for a widow to disappear in all this desert." Natasa sat down her inventory clipboard and met Venom's gaze. The younger man flinched involuntarily, something ancient and predatory flickering behind the widow's eyes. For a brief moment, his instincts screamed at him to run, though he couldn't. "Understand why? Let me be equally clear," Natasa replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded others in far deadlier circumstances. This trading post opens every morning to serve travelers and protect lives. It's been here 15 years, and it'll be here tomorrow. Now, either buy something or move along." Venom grabbed a satellite emergency beacon from the counter display and crushed it in his fist, scattering expensive electronics across the floor. "Wrong answer, Grandma. We'll be back tonight to show you how things work in our territory. Maybe we'll start with that fancy ham radio setup you got in the back. Shame if someone needed emergency help and couldn't get through." As the thugs swaggered out, their cars leaving clouds of dust in their wake, Natasa reached for the satellite phone in its hidden compartment. The number she dialed connected to a secure line used by a network of operatives scattered across the southwestern states, former special forces, intelligence officers, and specialized personnel who had chosen to continue their mission outside official channels. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, "Thunder Actual." "Thunder, this is Desert Shadow," Natasa spoke quietly, using a call sign that hadn't been needed in months. "Remember that favor you owe me from the Mogadishu extraction?" The voice on the other end softened with recognition. "Natasa Blackwood?" "The Natasa Blackwood from the 98 border operation. I've been waiting 15 years for this call. Never thought I'd need to make it, Marcus. But times change. We've got predators moving in on the water routes again. They're targeting vulnerable outposts, and they just made the mistake of starting with mine." "Talk to me, Natasa. What's the situation?" Natasa detailed the morning's events, her voice steady as she described the Scorpion Syndicate's threats. On the other end of the line, Marcus listened intently, though she could hear him already beginning to mobilize. "Your trading posts at Crossroads Junction, right?" His voice had taken on the crisp tone of operational planning. "Give me 4 hours, and Natasa, stay put. The old team is coming." After ending the call, Natasa began her preparations. To any customer walking in, nothing would have appeared different. She continued helping travelers, offering advice about desert safety, and maintaining her usual calm demeanor. But beneath the surface, subtle changes were taking place. A few extra water jugs were moved to strategic locations. Certain display cases were subtly repositioned to provide better cover. The emergency generator was topped off with fuel. Each motion was practiced, efficient, and entirely invisible to the untrained eye. Miguel, the Border Patrol agent, returned around noon, his face concerned. "Mrs. Blackwood, heard some troublemakers were asking about you. If you need any help..." Natasa smiled warmly at the young man's offer. "Thank you, Miguel, but I've got some old friends coming to visit. Everything's going to be just fine." Her voice carried absolute certainty, though not for the reasons the agent might have assumed. The desert sun climbed higher, its heat creating shimmering mirages on the horizon. To the east, a dust devil danced across the empty landscape, a reminder of how quickly things could spiral in these parts. Natasa Blackwood stood at her counter, watching, waiting, preparing. The quiet widow routine had served her well for 15 years, but sometimes circumstances required the desert shadow to emerge once more from retirement. The midday heat had just begun to wane when the first warning signs appeared. Carlos, a local rancher who grazed his cattle in the surrounding scrubland, pulled up to the trading post in his battered pickup truck. His weathered face carried the kind of tension Natasa had learned to read like approaching storm clouds. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called out, striding quickly into the store, "been seeing strange vehicles out by the old copper mine. Not the usual smuggler routes. These folks are asking questions about local businesses, especially yours." Natasa nodded, her hands steady as she restocked the medical supplies shelf. "What kind of questions, Carlos?" "Bad kind. About security, schedules, who comes and goes." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "My cousin works at the diner in Snake Valley. Says, these Scorpion boys aren't just thugs. They're organized, got connections with some cartel remnants. They've been systematically taking over the supply routes between here and the border. Natasa's mind mapped the implications. The copper mine was an ideal staging area. Multiple access roads, good visibility, easy to defend. How many vehicles did you spot? 5, maybe 6, modified for desert running. They've got radio equipment too, professional stuff. Carlos paused, studying her face. Mrs. Blackwood, maybe you should consider closing up for a few days, at least until... This post stays open, Carlos, Natasa interrupted gently but firmly. Too many lives depend on it. You know how many stranded travelers we get out here. How many border patrol units count on our water reserves? The rancher nodded reluctantly. Still got that old runway out back? The one your husband used for supply drops? Hasn't been used in years, Natasa replied carefully, though both of them knew that was only partially true. The hidden airstrip, concealed by natural rock formations, had served more clandestine purposes over the years. As Carlos left, a sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Dr. Rachel Chen, the region's only traveling physician, emerged with her medical bag. Her arrival was no coincidence. She was one of the few who knew Natasa's true background. Thought you might need some extra supplies, Rachel said meaningfully, placing a heavy bag on the counter. Inside, beneath a layer of legitimate medical equipment, Natasa glimpsed the familiar shape of tactical gear. Word travels fast in the desert. The clinic's been getting reports from other towns. These Scorpion people, they're methodical. They start with demands, then intimidation. In Copper Springs, they contaminated the town's main water supply when the local council refused to pay. Natasa's expression hardened. Access to water was sacred in the desert. Targeting it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Any casualties? No. Deaths, thankfully, but 6 people hospitalized, including 2 children. Rachel began arranging supplies with practiced efficiency. They're getting bolder. Sheriff's Department is overwhelmed. State police are focused on the border and federal agencies. She shrugged expressively. Sometimes official channels aren't the answer, Natasa replied quietly, thinking of the network she'd helped build over decades. Sometimes the desert needs to handle its own problems. The afternoon brought more visitors, each carrying pieces of intelligence disguised as casual conversation. Natasa absorbed it all, building a mental picture of the Scorpion Syndicate's operation. Their leader, the man calling himself Venom, had a background in military logistics, dishonorable discharge according to whispered rumors. He'd spent the last year building his organization, using the vast desert spaces to hide their movements. Around 3 o'clock, a dusty motorcycle roared up to the trading post. The rider, a lean woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair tied back in a tight braid, dismounted with fluid grace. Her leather jacket bore the patches of someone who'd spent serious time in the world's hot zones. Heard you might need some specialty items, the woman said, approaching the counter. Her call sign had been Sidewinder during their operational days. Marcus sent me ahead to assess the situation. Natasa smiled at her old friend. Kate, it's been too long. How's retirement treating you? About as well as it's treating you, apparently. Kate's eyes swept the trading post with professional assessment. Nice setup. Multiple exit points. Good fields of fire. Reinforced walls behind that rustic wooden paneling. You've been planning for this day. Planning, hoping it would never come, Natasa admitted. But you can't spend 30 years in operations without developing certain habits. Kate nodded, understanding perfectly. She'd served with Natasa in multiple theaters back when Desert Shadow had been more than just a whispered legend. Got 4 teams en route. Should be in position before sunset. These Scorpion boys picked the wrong widow to threaten. As they discussed positioning and response scenarios, more seemingly ordinary customers filtered through the trading post. Each one carried the subtle marks of their former professions. The way they moved, how they scanned rooms, the precise language they used. To most observers, they appeared to be nothing more than the usual desert travelers, but Natasa recognized each one. Her network was assembling. A young woman at the gas pumps was actually a former NSA signals expert. The elderly couple examining maps were retired Delta Force operators. The trucker checking his engine had once run surveillance operations across 3 continents. One by one they arrived, each bringing specialized skills and equipment disguised as ordinary cargo. Natasa maintained her widow's demeanor, serving customers and offering travel advice. But beneath the surface, a familiar tension was building. The desert winds had shifted, carrying the promise of approaching storm clouds. In the distance, heat lightning flickered across the horizon. Nature itself seemed to be preparing for the confrontation to come. Kate finished her preliminary assessment and prepared to leave. "Like old times," she said with a grim smile. "You know, most people would have sold this place years ago, moved somewhere easier." Natasa looked out across the sun-baked landscape she'd called home for 15 years. "The desert has its own kind of justice, Kate. Sometimes it needs people who understand that. Who understand that true strength isn't about causing fear, but about protecting those who can't protect themselves." As the afternoon stretched toward evening, more pieces fell into place. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal what happened when modern-day predators encountered an older, more experienced kind of hunter. The desert shadow was awakening, and with her, a network of operatives who had never truly retired from their mission of justice. The quiet afternoon shattered with the roar of modified engines as the Scorpion Syndicate's vehicles descended on the trading post. The convoy had grown. Now 6 matte black cars prowled into the parking area, their exhausts crackling aggressively in the cooling desert air. Natasa noted through practiced eyes that her current customers, a family loading up their RV and a pair of hikers, quickly finished their business and departed. Venom emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by more men than his morning visit. The scorpion tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe in the fading sunlight as he approached the entrance. His confident swagger spoke of someone who believed fear was the ultimate currency in these desert lands. "Told you we'd be back, Grandma," he called out, his voice carrying across the now empty parking area. "Hope you've had time to reconsider our generous offer." His men spread out, their movements betraying varying levels of military training. Some clearly experienced, others merely mimicking what they'd seen in movies. Natasa stood calmly behind her counter, her silver hair neatly braided, looking every bit the vulnerable widow they assumed her to be. "The trading post closes at sunset," she said evenly. "You've got about 20 minutes to make your purchases." Venom's face darkened as he strode inside, 4 of his men following while others maintained positions outside. "You're not understanding the situation here, lady. This isn't a negotiation. This is us telling you how things are going to be from now on." One of his men, younger than the others with a fresh scorpion tattoo that marked him as a new recruit, began roughly pulling supplies off shelves. Another started opening cabinets behind the counter, searching for valuables or possibly the communications equipment they'd noticed earlier. "Careful with those water filters," Natasa advised the young recruit, her voice carrying a weight that made him pause momentarily. "People's lives depend on this equipment." Venom slammed his hand on the counter, trying to startle her. Natasa didn't flinch. "People's lives depend on our protection out here, old woman. Lots of dangerous folks in the desert, lots of accidents waiting to happen." "You're right about one thing," Natasa replied, her tone shifting subtly. "There are dangerous folks in the desert, but I don't think you know who they really are." Something in her voice made Venom study her more carefully. For the first time, he seemed to notice details he'd overlooked. The precise arrangement of the store's layout, the multiple lines of sight, the fact that despite his intimidating presence, this silver-haired widow hadn't shown a trace of fear. "Check the back room," he barked to his men, trying to regain control of the situation. "Find that radio equipment. Maybe after we smash it up, she'll understand we're serious." Two of his men moved toward the back storage area. Natasa made no move to stop them, but her slight smile suggested she knew something they didn't. "You know," she said conversationally, "my husband used to say something about the desert. Said there are two kinds of predators out here. The young ones who make a lot of noise, show their fangs to everyone they meet. And the old ones, the ones who've survived decades in this wilderness, you never see them coming. Your husband ain't here to help you, lady," Venom sneered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "No, he's not," Natasa agreed, "but his lessons stuck, like how to choose the right location for a trading post, multiple access routes, clear lines of sight, defensible positions, or how to build a network of people who understand that the desert has its own kind of justice." The two men returned from the back room, looking confused. "Boss, the radio gear's gone. Everything's gone from back there." Venom's face contorted with rage. He reached across the counter, grabbing Natasa's collar. "Where's the equipment, old woman? What game are you playing?" Natasa's calm demeanor never wavered. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. You see, there's another thing my husband taught me about the desert. In the right hands, it's not just territory, it's a weapon." As if on cue, the power went out, plunging the trading post into sudden darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a dim red glow. Outside, engines could be heard starting up, but not the Scorpion Syndicate's vehicles. What the hell? One of Venom's men rushed to the window. "Boss, our cars! Someone's disabled them!" The wind chimes Natasa had hung 15 years ago began to sing, their melody now carrying an almost eerie quality in the red-tinted darkness. Through the windows, shadows moved across the desert landscape, disciplined, purposeful movements that spoke of years of tactical training. "Remember how I said this trading post has been here 15 years? Natasa's voice carried clearly in the tense silence. "That's how long it's been since I left active service. Since Desert Shadow became just another legend whispered around. Campfires, but legends have a way of coming back when they're needed." Venom's face went pale as realization dawned. "Desert Shadow? That's just a story. A ghost story about some spec ops team that—" His voice trailed off as Natasa's eyes met his, and he finally recognized what he'd been missing, the steady gaze of a predator who had been hunting long before he'd earned his first tattoo. "Ghost stories," Natasa replied softly, "sometimes have a way of becoming very, very real." Natasa reached beneath her counter, past the customer logbook, and withdrew an old photograph. The image was worn at the edges, but carefully preserved under lamination. "Before we continue this little confrontation," she said calmly, "I think you should see something, Derek." Venom's face went white. "How do you know that name?" "Because," Natasa held out the photograph, "I served with your mother in Baghdad, 2003. Jessica Martinez, best combat medic I ever knew. Saved my life twice before a roadside bomb got her." Her voice softened with genuine emotion. "Her last words were about you." The trading post had gone completely silent. Even the wind chimes seemed to hold their song. Venom, Derek, stared at the photograph, his hands trembling as he recognized his mother's young face among a group of soldiers in desert camouflage. "You're lying," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Natasa reached into another hidden compartment and pulled out a medical kit. Not the standard first aid supplies she sold to travelers, but a combat medic's personal kit, complete with worn canvas-carrying case. "Your mother carried this every mission," said the St. Christopher medal sewn into the lining gave her strength knowing she had a son to go home to. Derek's shaking hands traced the medal still visible beneath the worn fabric. The rest of his men shifted uncomfortably, their tough guy facades cracking as they watched their leader confront a past he'd clearly buried. The sound of motorcycles and vehicles filled the desert night. But this time, it was different. Multiple engines approached from various directions, their drivers moving with military precision. The Veterans Support Network, Natasa's hidden army, had arrived in force. Your mother was more than just a medic, Natasa continued, her voice gentle but firm. She was a guardian. She understood that true strength comes from protecting others, not terrorizing them. Is this how you honor her memory? By threatening innocent people, by poisoning water supplies? Derek's head snapped up. How did you? I know everything that happens in my desert, Natasa replied. Every threat, every act of violence, every attempt to prey on the vulnerable. Your mother gave her life protecting others. What would she think of what you've become? The trading post's door opened, and Kate Sidewinder stepped inside, her presence commanding respect. More figures appeared at the windows, veterans and operators who had served across multiple conflicts, now united in a different kind of mission. Found these in their vehicles, Kate announced, dropping a duffel bag that clinked with the sound of copper pipe bombs. Same signature as the devices used in Copper Springs. Looks like they were planning to contaminate more water supplies. One of Derek's men, the young recruit who'd been manhandling the water filters earlier, suddenly stepped back. I'm out, boss, he announced, his voice shaking. You said we were just running a protection racket, never signed up for poisoning kids. Natasa focused her attention on the young man. What's your name, son? Tommy, he replied, unable to meet her gaze. Tommy Rodriguez. Well, Tommy Rodriguez, right now you've got a choice to make. The same choice everyone faces out here in the desert. Be a predator or be a guardian. More of Derek's men began backing away from their leader, their manufactured toughness melting under the combined gaze of real warriors. But Natasa kept her eyes on Derek, who was still staring at his mother's medical kit. She used to write to me, he said suddenly, his voice cracking. Every week, from wherever they deployed her. Told me stories about the lives she saved, the people she helped after she died. I got lost, angry. Thought being strong meant making others afraid. Kate moved closer, her voice surprisingly gentle. We've got a support network, Derek. Veterans helping veterans, families helping families. Your mother was part of our brotherhood. That makes you family too. The tension in the trading post had transformed completely. Where there had been threat and intimidation, now there was something different. Understanding, pain, and perhaps the first seeds of redemption. The devices in their vehicles, Derek spoke up suddenly. There's more. Stockpiled at the copper mine. And charts, details of every water source from here to the border. They weren't my idea, but I let it happen. Told myself it was just business. Contaminating water supplies is never just business, Natasa said firmly. Out here, water is life. Your mother understood that. She spent her last mission protecting a village's wells from insurgents who tried to poison them. Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward again. I know something about water systems. Used to work maintenance for the county before all this. I could help locate the stockpiles, maybe even help design better protection for the local water supplies. Natasa nodded approvingly. Redemption starts with a single step, Tommy. Using your skills to protect instead of harm. That's real strength. The night wind had picked up, sending Natasa's wind chimes into a complex melody. Through the windows, more vehicles could be seen arriving, veterans and operators coming together to face a threat to their desert community. But the real battle, Natasa knew, had already been won. Sometimes the strongest weapon against darkness isn't force. It's the truth about who we are and who we're meant to be. Derek Wilson, known to his gang as Venom, stood frozen, his mother's medical kit trembling in his hands as more vehicles arrived at the trading post. The contrast was striking. On one side, the Scorpion Syndicate's black muscle cars, now disabled. On the other, an array of rugged vehicles carrying veterans and operators who had nothing left to prove. Your mother carried that kit through 3 tours, Natasa continued, her voice gentle but firm. When things got rough, she'd look at that medal and tell us stories about her little boy back home, about how she wanted you to grow up understanding what real service means. Marcus's heavy-duty truck pulled up to the front of the group, the VSN commander dismounting with the fluid grace of someone who'd never really left the field. He approached Natasa with a warm smile, and they embraced like old comrades before he turned to face Derek. "Your mum was the reason half of our unit made it home," Marcus said. "When we were pinned down outside Fallujah, communications knocked out. Jessica ran through enemy fire to reach the wounded, spent 6 hours stabilizing casualties while calling in coordinates for evacuation. Never met a braver soul." Derek's gang members shifted uncomfortably, looking between their leader and the growing circle of veterans. Tommy Rodriguez, the young member with a conscience, took another step forward. "I want to help make this right," he announced firmly. "All of it." "Shut it, Rodriguez," another gang member snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "No." Tommy stood his ground. "My dad was a Marine. He'd beat my ass if he knew what we've been doing to these communities. Mrs. Blackwood," he turned to Natasa, "I'm sorry for all of it." One by one, other Scorpion members began backing away from the confrontation, their manufactured toughness crumbling under the weight of reality. Kate Sidewinder had begun organizing the veterans, sending teams to secure the perimeter and begin checking other suspected cache locations. "We've got a base camp 20 miles south," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the trading post. "Veterans gather there twice a week, share stories, help each other out, coordinate support for desert communities. Your mother's name is on our wall of heroes, Derek. Maybe it's time you came to hear some stories about her, learn who she really was." A young woman emerged from one of the recently arrived vehicles, carrying a ruggedized laptop. "Mrs. Blackwood," she called out, "I've mapped the water sources most at risk based on the intel we gathered. We should prioritize the ones serving isolated communities first." Natasa nodded, then turned to Tommy. "You said you know water systems. We could use that knowledge to protect these resources, not destroy them." Tommy straightened up, something like pride flickering across his face. "Yes, ma'am. I can help identify vulnerabilities, design safeguards, maybe even improve some of the older systems." Derek had been silent, still holding his mother's kit, but now he spoke up. "The copper mine," he said suddenly. "It's not just explosives. We've got maps, supply routes, details of every vulnerable point from here to the border. I want to help shut it all down." "That's a good start," Kate acknowledged. "Recognizing our mistakes, working to fix what we've broken. That's real strength, Derek. Your mother would understand that better than anyone." More veterans had begun arriving, their vehicles forming a protective circle around the trading post. The VSN's communication network was humming with activity as teams coordinated their response to this threat to their desert community. "Your mother believed in second chances," Natasa told Derek. "Said everyone deserves one shot at redemption. Question is, what are you going to do with yours?" Derek finally looked up from the medical kit, his eyes clear for the first time since arriving. Can you tell me more about her, about what she was really like in the field?" Natasa smiled, gesturing to the trading post's small sitting area. "Better than that. See all these men and women here? Each one has a story about Jessica Martinez, about her courage, her dedication, her love for her family. Take a seat, son. Coffee's hot and stories are what we do best out here." The tension in the parking lot had transformed completely. Where there had been threat and intimidation, now there was something different. Understanding, respect, maybe even the beginnings of healing. Kate began organizing the veterans, sending some to investigate the copper mine, others to start planning protection details for vulnerable water sources. The remaining Scorpion members, stripped of their false bravado, found themselves surrounded by men and women who had faced real battles and emerged stronger for it. Natasa brought out coffee and some of her emergency rations, the trading post's atmosphere shifting from confrontation to conversation. "Your mother once told me," Natasa said as Derek sat down, still clutching the medical kit, "that true strength isn't about making others fear you. It's about being someone others can count on, about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The desert night had fully settled in, the stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the trading post. Veterans gathered in small groups, some sitting on their vehicles, others standing in circles, all ready to share stories of a fallen hero with her lost son. The trading post, as it had for 15 years, continued serving as a beacon in the desert, only now that beacon was drawing in those who needed guidance more than they knew. As the night stretched deeper into darkness, more veterans arrived at Natasa's trading post. Each one had a story about Jessica Martinez, and Derek sat there absorbing every word, occasionally wiping tears from his eyes. His mother's medical kit never left his lap, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the canvas. "Your mom had this way about her," a veteran named Jack was saying. "Even in the worst situations, she'd find hope. Remember that sandstorm in Aero 3, Natasa, when she used her own water rations to clean wounds for 3 days straight?" Natasa nodded, pouring more coffee for the group. "Kept the whole unit's spirits up, singing those old Spanish lullabies while she worked. Same ones she used to sing to you, Derek." Derek's voice cracked. "Las Mañanitas. She'd sing it every birthday, even when she was deployed. Said it connected us, no matter how far apart we were." Tommy Rodriguez had been working with Kate and the communications specialist, mapping out vulnerable water sources. He approached the group hesitantly. "Mrs. Blackwood, about the water supplies I was the one who designed the contamination methods. I need to make it right, not just because I have to, but because I need to." Kate, who had been coordinating with other VSN teams on her radio, turned to Tommy. "What's your background, son?" "Besides environmental terrorism," Tommy flushed red. 4 years civil engineering, ma'am, before I dropped out. Specialized in municipal water systems. The irony isn't lost on me." "Good skills," she nodded thoughtfully. "We could use that. These desert communities need more than just protection. They need infrastructure improvement. Want to lead some legitimate projects?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm one of the ones who... Redemption isn't just about..." "Saying sorry," Marcus interrupted, joining the conversation. "It's about actions, using your skills to build instead of destroy. That's how we honor the fallen." Derek looked up from another photograph Natasa had shared, one showing his mother treating children in a war-torn village. "The whole syndicate will help," he said firmly, looking at his remaining men. "It's not negotiable." None disagreed. Natasa, who had been making satellite phone calls, hung up with a satisfied expression. "Just talked to the tribal council at 3 Rivers Reservation. They're willing to give you boys a chance to make things right. Says if you're serious about changing, they might have some work for you." "That's more than we deserve," Derek said. Quietly. "Deserves got nothing to do with it," Natasa replied. "Your mother taught me that after I lost my husband. Felt guilty about surviving when he didn't. Jessica sat with me all night talking about forgiveness, about how life gives us chances to rebuild, not because we deserve them, but because that's how we heal." A new vehicle approached the trading post, a police cruiser. Sheriff Elena Rodriguez, Tommy's aunt, stepped out. The Scorpion members tensed, but Kate held up a hand. "It's okay," she assured them. "Elena's one of us. Desert Storm, combat search, and rescue." The sheriff removed her hat, revealing graying hair and weathered features. She surveyed the scene. Veterans mingling with former gang members, coffee being shared, stories being told. "Got some reports about a disturbance out here," she said, approaching Natasa's counter. "Though from what I'm seeing, looks more like a family reunion. More like a reconciliation," Natasa answered, sliding a cup of coffee toward the sheriff. "Remember Jessica Martinez? Elena's face softened. Jessie from Baghdad? Who could forget? She turned to Derek, recognition dawning. You're her boy, aren't you? Got her eyes? Derek nodded, unable to speak. We're working on making things right, Kate explained to Elena. Starting with protecting the water supplies. These boys are trading in their scorpion patches for work gloves. Elena considered this, sipping her coffee. Well, Tom, she addressed. Her nephew, your father's been worried sick, keeps saying he failed you somehow. No, Tia, Tommy replied firmly. Dad didn't fail me, I failed myself, but I want to make it right. Use what I know to help people instead of hurt them. Then, let's start with the paperwork, Elena replied, pulling out her notepad. I'll need statements about all the water sources you've targeted. Can't move forward without facing up to what's behind us. For the next hour, Derek and his remaining gang members detailed their activities. Some scorpions had fled when the veterans arrived, but those who stayed held nothing back. Elena took their statements, her face grim but her eyes understanding. Meanwhile, Kate had organized the veterans into teams. Some would help secure and repair damaged water systems. Others would reach out to threatened communities. Marcus was already planning a series of town halls to rebuild trust. Your mother believed in community, Natasa told Derek as the young man finished his statement. Said it was like the human body, every part connected, each one vital. Harm one part, you harm the whole. Heal one part, you begin healing everything. Tommy, who'd been sketching infrastructure plans with some of the veterans, looked up. We could be part of that healing, couldn't we? Use our knowledge of the weak points to make things stronger. I've been thinking about sustainable water, systems, ways to protect against future threats. Kate smiled approvingly. Now you're thinking like a guardian. VSN's got some projects coming up, installing solar-powered purification systems in remote communities. Could use someone who understands the technical side. The transformation in the trading post was remarkable. Where hours ago there had been tension and threat of violence, now there was purpose and planning. The Scorpion Syndicate was dissolving, but something new was being born in its place. Natasa organized a supply run to the nearest communities affected by the Scorpion Syndicate's activities. Under the desert stars, trucks were loaded with water, medical supplies and repair equipment. The trading post's parking lot had transformed into a command center, with veterans and former gang members working side by side. These communities won't trust us at first, Derek said, helping load purification equipment onto a truck. After what we did, trust is earned, Kate replied, checking a map spread across her motorcycle's seat. One day at a time, one action at a time. Your mother understood that better than anyone. The transformation was visible in the former gang members. Gone were the aggressive postures and hostile glares, replaced by focused determination. Tommy Rodriguez had taken charge of the technical planning, his engineering background finally being used for something meaningful. Look at these blueprints, he explained to a group of veterans, pointing to detailed drawings. Most desert communities rely on single-source water systems, makes them vulnerable, but if we implement redundant supplies, backup purification. His hands moved across the paper with renewed purpose. Natasa watched from her counter as the night's activities unfolded. Elena had finished taking statements and was now coordinating with other law enforcement agencies. The sheriff's practical approach to justice was exactly what the situation needed. Got word from the DA's office, Elena announced, joining Natasa. Given the circumstances and the boys' willingness to make amends, we can handle this through community restoration rather than prosecution. But, she added, making eye contact with each former Scorpion member, this is your one chance. Make it count. We will, ma'am, Derek replied, his voice firm. Marcus had spread out a large terrain map on one of the trading post's tables. Veterans and former gang members gathered around it, marking locations of vulnerable water sources and planning. Their community restoration efforts. Priority is Three Rivers Reservation, Kate was saying, circling the location. Tommy, you said you can lead that repair operation. Tommy nodded eagerly. Yes, Ma'am. Been studying their system. They're using outdated filtration technology. We can make it better, more efficient, maybe add solar backup pumps for power failures. Good thinking, Marcus approved. These communities need more than just repairs. They need improvements that will last. Natasa, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. Remember that underground spring survey my husband did years ago? The one that mapped all the natural water sources in the region. Kate's eyes lit up with recognition. The aquifer study. That could be invaluable for planning sustainable water systems. Derek, who had been studying the map intently, pointed to several locations. These communities here, we didn't damage their water supplies, but we scared them, threatened them. We need to make that right too. Admitting wrong is the first step, Natasa said. Making it right is the journey. A veteran named Mike, who'd been coordinating with other VSN chapters, on his satellite phone, joined the group. Got good news. Chapters from 3 states are sending equipment and supplies, water purification systems, solar panels, construction materials, everything we need. They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon. That's great, Tommy said enthusiastically, then hesitated. But where do we store everything? Some of these communities don't have secure facilities. Natasa exchanged looks with Kate, who nodded. The old warehouse behind the trading post, Natasa offered. My husband built it for emergency supplies. It's perfect for a distribution center. Command center, Derek repeated softly, running his fingers over his mother's medical kit. Mom would have liked that term. Speaking of terms, Kate interjected, you boys need a new identity. Can't keep calling yourselves the Scorpion Syndicate if you're going to be working with the VSN. The former gang members looked at each other. Uncertainly, it was Tommy who spoke first. What about Martinez's guardians? To honor Derek's mom and maybe all those who protect others? The suggestion hung in the air for a moment. Derek's eyes welled up with tears again, but this time they were tears of pride. If that's okay, Tommy added quickly. I mean, we'd have to earn it, Marcus clapped Tommy on the shoulder. Son, wanting to earn it is exactly why you deserve to use it. Natasa watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. The trading post had always been more than just a business. It was a waypoint, a haven, a place of new beginnings. Tonight proved that more than ever. Elena, who had been making calls of her own, rejoined the group. Just talked to the tribal council. They're on board with the restoration project. They're even talking about making it a region-wide effort. Seems people are tired of living in fear. Fear versus respect, Natasa mused. Jessica used to talk about that. Fear divides, but respect unites, Derek said, quoting his mother's words from memories he'd long suppressed. The night continued with more planning and preparation. Veterans shared their expertise, while the former gang members contributed their knowledge of the region's vulnerabilities. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into something none of them could have predicted. Natasa's wind chimes sang softly in the desert breeze, their melody now seeming to celebrate the change taking place. The trading post, as it had for 15 years, continued serving as a beacon of hope in the vast desert. But now its light seemed to shine even brighter, illuminating a path forward for those who had lost their way. The first light of dawn was just beginning to paint the desert sky when the initial convoy of supply trucks arrived at Natasa's trading. In post, the parking area, still buzzing with activity from the night's planning, transformed into a highly efficient distribution center. Veterans and former Scorpion members worked together, unloading equipment and organizing supplies with military precision. Mrs. Blackwood, Tommy called out, holding up a sophisticated water testing kit. Look what the Phoenix chapter sent us. With this, we can analyze contamination levels in minutes instead of waiting for lab results. Natasa smiled, watching the young man's enthusiasm. The engineer who had once designed ways to poison water supplies was now leading efforts to protect them. Transformation came in many forms in the desert. Derek, who had been coordinating with Elena about security arrangements, approached the trading post's counter. His mother's medical kit was now properly secured across his shoulder, worn with the same pride she once had. "The tribal council's watermaster is on his way," he reported. "Wants to see our restoration plans firsthand. Never thought I'd be nervous about a presentation, but—" "You'll do fine," Natasa assured him. "Just remember what this is really about, protecting people, just like your mother did." The trading post had become a hub of unprecedented activity. Kate had transformed the back area into an operations center with maps and satellite imagery, covering every available surface. Veterans with various specialties were conducting crash courses for the former gang members, teaching everything from water safety protocols to community relations. Around mid-morning, a dusty pickup truck arrived, carrying James Running Bear, the Three Rivers Reservation's watermaster. His weathered face carried decades of experience managing desert water resources. The former Scorpion members tensed, but Tommy stepped forward with his plans. "Sir," he began, spreading out his detailed drawings, "I've been studying your current water system. The main vulnerability is here, at the primary pumping station. But if we implement a distributed network with redundant purification systems and solar-powered backup pumps—" Running Bear listened intently, his expression transforming from skepticism to interest as Tommy explained the technical details. "You understand water systems well," he observed. "Yes, sir," Tommy admitted. "Used to use that knowledge for wrong. Now I want to use it right." The watermaster nodded slowly. "Our people have a saying, 'Water knows the truth.' You cannot deceive. It cannot force it. You can only work with it, protect it, respect it." Derek joined them, holding more detailed maps. "We've identified all the vulnerable points in the regional water network, not just the reservation system, but all the communities. Out here, we want to help secure everything, and why should we trust you?" Running Bear asked directly, though his tone held more curiosity than accusation. Derek touched his mother's medical kit. "Because I learned the hard way that true strength comes from protecting others, not threatening them. My mother knew that. She gave her life believing it." Natasa, who had been listening while serving coffee to the growing crowd of workers, spoke up. "James, you remember Jessica Martinez, the combat medic who treated your son after that snakebite incident during the border crisis?" Running Bear's eyes widened with recognition. "The singing healer, the one who knew our traditional medicine songs?" He looked at Derek with new understanding. "You are her son." Derek nodded, surprised. "She knew your medicine songs, learned them while treating our people, said healing wasn't just about medicine, it was about respecting traditions, understanding, connections." Running Bear studied the young man thoughtfully. "Perhaps this is why you have returned to the right path. Water and blood, both remember their true nature." The morning continued with intensive planning. Running Bear's knowledge of traditional water management, combined with Tommy's engineering expertise and the veteran's security experience, created a comprehensive approach to regional water protection. Kate, who had been coordinating with other VSN chapters, brought more good news. "Got teams coming in from 6 states now, word spreading about what we're doing here. Other communities want to implement similar programs." "This is becoming something bigger than we imagined," Marcus observed, studying the growing operation. Natasa nodded, watching the activity from her counter. "That's how healing works in the desert. One drop of water can create ripples that spread far beyond its source." The trading post's atmosphere was electric with purpose. Veterans were teaching former gang members about security protocols while Tommy led technical training sessions on water system maintenance. Eleanor had brought in additional law enforcement officers who were learning about the community-based approach to rehabilitation. Mrs. Blackwood, Tommy approached with another set of drawings. I've been thinking about your trading post too. We could set up an emergency water purification station here, make it a backup supply point for the whole region. Natasa studied the plans, impressed by the detail. My husband always said this place needed to be more than just a store, needed to be a lifeline. That's what we're building, Derek added, joining them. Not just fixing what we broke, but making everything stronger. Mum would have wanted that. Around noon, more vehicles arrived. Community leaders from other affected towns, drawn by word of what was happening at the trading post. Natasa watched as Derek and Tommy presented their restoration plans, their former swagger replaced by genuine dedication. The desert sun climbed higher, but the work continued unabated. What had started as a confrontation had evolved into something remarkable, a model for community restoration that combined technical expertise, traditional wisdom, and the power of redemption. Natasa's wind chimes sang in the hot breeze, their melody now seeming to celebrate each small victory, each step toward healing. The trading post, as it had for 15 years, continued serving as a beacon in the desert, but now its light reached further, touching lives in ways she had never imagined possible. By late afternoon, the transformation at the trading post was impossible to miss. The parking area had become a staging ground for water restoration projects across the region. Supply trucks came and went, carrying equipment and materials to communities that had once lived in fear of the Scorpion Syndicate. Now, those same communities were witnessing something extraordinary. "Look at this," Tommy exclaimed, reviewing data on his laptop. "We've already secured 3 major water sources. The purification systems are showing better quality levels than before everything happened." Derek, who had spent the day coordinating with tribal leaders, joined him at the planning table. 3 Rivers Reservations Council just approved our full proposal. They want us to train their young people in water system maintenance. Natasa, watching from her counter, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The trading post had always been a sanctuary in the desert, but now it had become something more, a symbol of transformation and hope. Kate approached, her satellite phone buzzing with constant updates. "Just got word from the Copper Springs team. They've cleared the last of the explosive devices from the water treatment plant. Found something else too. Detailed plans for hitting water supplies all across the southwest." "Those were my plans," Tommy admitted, his face flushing with shame. "I can help decode them, show where else might be at risk." "Already on it," Eleanor added, joining the conversation. "Got task forces forming in 3 states. They're using your intel to prevent attacks before they happen. Sometimes the best weapon against darkness is someone who's walked through it." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape as more community members arrived at the trading post. Mrs. Chen from the local diner had brought food for the workers, and the atmosphere had taken on an almost festive quality. Veterans and former gang members shared meals together, swapping stories and planning future projects. "You know what this reminds me of?" Marcus said quietly to Natasa. "That time in Baghdad when Jessica organized the neighborhood water distribution. During the crisis, remember what she said?" Natasa nodded, pouring fresh coffee. "Today, we're not soldiers or civilians, we're just people helping people survive." Derek overheard and added softly, "That's what we're doing here, isn't it? Helping people survive and thrive." Natasa corrected gently. "Your mother would be proud of this, Derek. Proud of you." The sun was beginning to set when Running Bear returned with more tribal elders. They watched as Tommy demonstrated the new water testing equipment, explaining how it could detect contaminants before they reached dangerous levels. "The old ways and the new," Running Bear observed, working together to protect what's precious. This is good medicine. Natasa's wind chimes sang in the evening breeze as the day's activities began to wind down. The trading post's lights cast a warm glow across the parking area, where maps and plans were still spread out on makeshift tables. Veterans continued sharing their knowledge with the former gang members, who absorbed everything with genuine dedication. "Mrs. Blackwood," Tommy approached, holding a thick folder. "I've been working on something, plans for expanding the trading post's role. We could turn it into a regional water safety training center, teach communities how to protect their resources." Natasa studied the young man's earnest face. "You found your calling, haven't you, Tommy?" He nodded, emotion thick in his voice. "All this time, I thought being strong meant having power over others. But real strength is using your gifts to protect, not destroy." Derek finished, joining them. "Mum tried to teach me that. Took me a long time to understand." Kate, who had been organizing the next day's operations, gathered everyone for a final briefing. The trading post's small sitting area was packed with veterans, former gang members, tribal leaders, and law enforcement officers, all united in a common purpose. "Tomorrow we start Phase 2, she announced. "Full assessment of regional water infrastructure, implementation of security protocols, and community training programs. The VSN is committing resources for the long haul." "And we're committed too," Derek added, speaking for his former gang members. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we're not just fixing what we broke, we're building something better." Elena shared updates from her department. "State's creating a new task force for desert resource protection. They want Tommy to consult on security measures." The young engineer looked stunned. "Me, but my record is being expunged," Elena replied. "In light of your cooperation and commitment to making things right. Sometimes the people who best understand how to protect something are the ones who once tried to destroy it." As night fell over the desert, the temperature dropped, but the sense of purpose remained warm and strong. Natasa's trading post had become more than just a waypoint. It was now a symbol of transformation, a place where past mistakes could be acknowledged and overcome. The wind chimes sang their evening song as Natasa looked out over the gathering. Veterans sharing coffee with former adversaries, tribal elders discussing water protection with young engineers, law enforcement officers planning community outreach programs. The desert had its own way of bringing people together, of turning enemies into allies, of transforming fear into hope. Derek stood at the counter, his mother's medical kit still across his shoulder. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked Natasa quietly. "When we first came in here threatening you, you knew exactly who I was." Natasa smiled gently. "I knew who you could be, just like your mother always knew. Sometimes the desert strips everything away until we're forced to face our true selves." The night sky above the trading post blazed with stars, their ancient light witnessing another story of redemption in the endless desert. The wind carried whispers of change across the landscape, promising that what had begun here would spread far beyond these sand-swept horizons. Above the moonlit desert, Natasa's wind chimes swayed gently, their melody a testament to change. Inside the trading post, Derek held his mother's medical kit, its worn canvas now a symbol of redemption rather than regret. "Today showed us what real strength looks like," Natasa said, pouring one last cup of coffee for the evening. "It's not about power over others, but power to protect." Tommy looked up from his laptop where he'd been finalizing water system designs. "Mrs. Blackwood, because of you, because of all of this, we found our true purpose. Mom always said the desert reveals who you really are." As the last vehicles pulled away from the trading post, their headlights cutting through the darkness like shooting stars, Natasa stepped outside. The desert stretched endlessly before her, no longer a place of fear and predators, but of guardians. and protectors. The trading post stood as it had for 15 years, but now it was more than just a sanctuary. It was a symbol of transformation. Derek joined her, the medical kit at his side. "You know what's strange?" he said quietly. "For the first time since Mom died, I feel like I'm making her proud." Natasa smiled, the wind chimes singing softly above them. "She was always proud. Derek, she just waited for you to remember who you really were." The desert night wrapped around them like a blanket of stars, each one a witness to the power of redemption. What had begun as a confrontation had blossomed into something beautiful, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, hope could flourish if given the chance to grow. The trading post lights cast a warm glow across the parking area, where maps and plans for future projects still lay spread out on tables. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and serve. But tonight they could rest, knowing that the desert had worked its magic once again, transforming predators into guardians, enemies into allies, and fear into hope. Hey, there, thanks for staying with us until the end of this incredible story of redemption and transformation. If you want to hear more remarkable tales of unlikely heroes and powerful transformations, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share in the comments below what touched you most about Natasa and Derek's journey, and join us tomorrow for another extraordinary story that will remind you that change is always possible, no matter how dark things might seem.